Mr. Lawrence Reed. We welcome him to our Pachyderm Club virtual online lectern to share his thoughts with us. Was Jesus a socialist?
Thank you so much, John. Special thanks to the Wichita Pachyderm Club, Americans for Prosperity, and the membership of both organizations for having me. I have been out your way multiple times, spoken to you in person, and I'm sorry we can't do that in person today, but I sure appreciate your tuning in as I talk from my fancy home studio here with the blanket hanging on the door behind me. So thanks so much for joining in, everybody. This talk, Was Jesus a Socialist?, has its roots in an essay which I wrote a few years ago, a short essay. It's available on our website at fee.org if you type in, Was Jesus a Socialist? But I'm happy to tell you that I have since expanded it into a full-blown book, just under 200 pages, so it's not a real long book. But I think it'll be a real hit around the country, at least hoping so, because it's meant to be a comprehensive analysis of this idea, which I think is a terrible misconception, that Jesus was in some way sympathetic to what we today call socialism. That book is due out in the first week of June, but you can pre-order it now. It's only about $15. You can get it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. It may be on other sites now too, I don't know, but for sure, Amazon and Barnes & Noble, they have it. So, and there's a lot more in it than was in that short essay or that I have time to share with you now. Well, to begin with, to answer this question, was Jesus a socialist? I think we have to begin with some mention of what socialism is. Needless to say, perhaps, that is seems to be a fluid definition. There was a time in American history, or world history actually, just a century ago, when socialism was widely understood to involve the government ownership of the means of production. And there were places in the world, of course, that tried that big time. And when it flopped, a lot of sympathizers thought, well, we'd better come up with another version. So now it means something different. But shortly, I'd like to share with you what I think it is, or what its distinguishing features are, so you'll know what I'm talking about when I address this question, was Jesus a socialist? First of all, socialism is not simply good intentions. I'm amazed at how many people think that that's the case. If you ask the ordinary American citizen, what is socialism? Some will say it's government control of the economy, and that's darn close. But there are a lot of people, disturbing number of people, who will say things like, well, it's sharing with others, it's caring for people, it's doing things for them, it's giving them stuff. It's thinking well of others and wanting to help them get through their lives. Some version of that. It's sort of like Jack and Jill sharing stuff. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the old Soviet Union, put it this way some years ago. He said that, and this is a direct quote, Jesus was the first socialist because he was the first to seek a better life for mankind. Now get that. Jesus was the first socialist because he was the first to seek a better life for mankind. If that's all socialism is, I'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who isn't one. I mean, just about everybody will at least say that they want a better life for mankind. Surely that is not a distinguishing characteristic of socialism. Then you have a lot of people who think that, it's government doing things for people, but it's only socialism as long as it appears to be working. And then when it flops, as it invariably has, those very same people will say, oh, well, that wasn't socialism after all. We'll get it right next time. And they'll give you endless and usually irrelevant reasons as to why that experiment they so look forward to actually didn't pan out. So that's why today it's hard to pin even socialists down on what socialism is, because the moment it flops, they switch to some other definition. Let me tell you what I think it is, or what its distinguishing characteristic is. And I'd like to do that typically by sharing a brief analogy with you. that contrasts capitalism, which is pretty much the opposite of socialism. It contrasts capitalism with socialism. If two Girl Scouts come to your door, ring the doorbell, and you answer, and they say, "Would you like to buy some cookies?" and you get to say yes or no, well, that's capitalism. But if those two Girl Scouts show up later with several cops behind them, maybe a SWAT team, and they're all armed, and they say, "You're going to buy these cookies and you're going to eat them and you're going to like them, whether you like it or not," that looks a lot more like socialism to me. And what is the distinguishing feature between those two analogies? In my uh, uh, belief, it is the use of force. That's the defining characteristic of socialism. Now, you listen to socialists, the so-called democratic socialists, especially in this country, like Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and they give you just streams of happy talk. They say it's, oh, we're going to provide for people, we're going to give everybody health care, we're going to give them free college, and we're going to do all these wonderful things for people. We're going to tamp down economic inequality so everybody has roughly the same, or at least not there isn't as much of a disparity as you otherwise might see in wealth and so forth. But if you listen closely to them, you'll realize rather quickly that they don't have a laundry list of mere suggestions that you might put on a comment card and put in the comment box. Uh, their proposals invariably call for the use of force. They're not saying, "Hey, here's a helpful hint or a tip for you to make your life better." No, they have a laundry list of things they want to impose on people. And that's what makes it different. I mean, those who say, no, socialism is caring and sharing, I always point out that, well, there's a lot more caring and sharing and giving and philanthropy and things like that under capitalism than you find under any socialized economy. So clearly, those things cannot be socialism's distinguishing characteristic. What is its distinguishing characteristic is the use of force. The fact that those who seek to achieve these various objectives are not content to achieve them through things like persuasion or voluntarism or exchange or the marketplace, the profit motive, the price system, the free enterprise, private property. They're more interested in trying to achieve those objectives through the use of force. And it's a real telling distinction, I think, between capitalism and socialism, that under capitalism, you could practice a kind of socialism if you wanted to. If you got a group of people together who thought like you did, and you said, "Hey, everybody, let's, whatever we might produce, let's put it all in a common storehouse, and then we'll divvy it up equally and give everybody the same amount." And that's a kind of socialism. Some socialists would like to achieve that objective anyway. You could do that under capitalism as long as you do so in a willing and voluntary fashion. Just get your neighbors together and get them all to agree to do this and go ahead and do it. But under socialism, it's very, very hard, if not impossible, for you to practice capitalism. All you have to do is look at countries around the world that say they practice socialism, and you'll find out how difficult that is. It's very difficult to start a business, to earn a profit, to be an entrepreneur, to compete with the government under socialism, because it has a monopolistic way of thinking. It wants to do the job and do it at the point of a gun, because many of its advocates think they have a monopoly on compassion and goodwill and those sorts of things. But I think you should think of socialism as the use of force in concentrated power in government. It's not, socialism isn't a multiplicity of power sources. It tends to concentrate power in a single authority. But then the question arises, well, for what purpose? If it's concentrated power and the use of force, to achieve what? And I want to give you several objectives that socialists embrace, several objectives that they want to use concentrated power and its political force to accomplish. And socialists will disagree among themselves, needless to say, about which of these objectives is most important to them, which they want to achieve more quickly than another, or what degree they're willing to compromise along the way. That there are differences, of course, but generally, socialists favor the use of concentrated power and its political force to achieve central planning of the economy. That is to say, instead of the price system, the profit motive, private property, consumer sovereignty, entrepreneurs, all those various parties and entities and forces interacting in a free marketplace. Instead of that, socialists generally want to achieve central planning, the use of force from the top to mandate, to issue edicts, maybe fix prices, determine what's produced, who gets it, that sort of thing, by the use of compulsion. So that's one objective of socialists, the central planning of the economy. Another is government ownership of property. Karl Marx specifically urged the government ownership of the means of production, but in the end, he would be more than happy to have government ownership of everything. He condemned private property as I point him out because he is the godfather of modern socialism since the middle part of the 19th century. He favored government ownership of not just the means of production, but just about all property. And then, so that's a second objective. And the third objective that socialists seek to achieve is the redistribution of wealth, generally by leveling wealth so that there are fewer people at the top, or at least they're earning less, and people at the other end of the totem pole, so to speak, get more. A more equal redistribution of wealth. Now, again, socialists will differ among themselves as to which of those objectives is their most important. But I think all of their support for the use of political force comes down to achieving one or two or all three of those objectives to one degree or another. When I first, now that's as background to explain what I mean by socialism. When I first heard that Jesus was sympathetic to those objectives or was in some way a socialist, I was a teenager. I'm one of those maybe unusual people who got involved in the movement for liberty and free markets at a very early age and chose my college because I wanted to study under a renowned free market friendly professor, Dr. Hans Senholz at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. So I was in my teenage years at the time, and I remember thinking, wait a minute, how could that be? My understanding of socialism is that there's a lot of force involved in it. A lot of people seem to go to jail for disagreeing with the government or doing things that seem to have no victims, but simply run afoul of the government planners in some way. And so how could Jesus favor that kind of thing? I mean, even the most important decision that every person has to make, according to Christian doctrine, is left up to the free will of each individual. And that is, of course, whether or not to accept Jesus Christ as one's Savior. So if that most important ultimate decision is left up to you to decide, how much sense would it make for so many other aspects of life to be under the thumb of the police or the dictator, the emperor, or the all-powerful elite of political people, with all the temptations that always brings for corruption in power? How could Jesus support those things? That's not the Jesus that I came to know or know to this day. So that's what got me thinking about these things. I dabbled in this issue a little bit at college, wrote a short essay on it. But it was only about 5 years ago when I finally sat down, rankled as I was with so many people saying this, that Jesus was a socialist, and I sat down and wrote something about it. And now that's what I've expanded into this forthcoming book. You can scour the New Testament, and I urge everyone to do this, whether you're a Christian or not. By the way, I should have mentioned this at the outset. I am a Christian, but I'm not giving this lecture with the idea that I'm proselytizing for my faith or for any denomination. And I don't mean for this message to be particular only to a faith community. I hope that anybody of faith or a different faith or of no faith will find some of what I say to be interesting. If you're interested in nothing more than the facts and evidence and truth, if you want to know more what Jesus actually said and what he stood for, then I hope you'll find this useful, regardless of your personal faith. But you can scour the New Testament and not find any suggestion from Jesus that he would endorse the use of force to accomplish any of those objectives that I talked about. No place do you find him suggesting that, yeah, we should use government to redistribute income, or that government should take over industries, or nationalize this or that, or own the means of production, or that central planning bureaucrats should plan an economy. He had many other things on his mind that were much more personal in nature. And you won't find any endorsement from him on any of those things. And when he does address things that are largely economic in content, you'll find, as I will explain in a moment, a great degree of sympathy for what I would call freedom and free markets. Jesus said, first of all, that he came to fulfill the law. And someone might look at that and say, the law, well, that's government. So he must be endorsing whatever government's lay down as the law. But by the law, he was referring to the Mosaic law and the prophecies of the prophets before him. The Mosaic law, core to that, of course, is the Ten Commandments. And I want to point out that the eighth commandment, I think, has a lot to say about things related to economics and the distinction between free markets or capitalism on the one hand and socialism on the other. The eighth commandment says, thou shalt not steal. And I always like to point out that there's a period after the word steal. It does not say thou shalt not steal unless you're absolutely sure that you can spend it better than the guy who earned it. It doesn't say thou shalt not steal unless the other guy has more than you do. Or thou shalt not steal unless you can find a politician to do it on your behalf and then give you the stuff. It says thou shalt not steal, period. It's a very strong endorsement, I think, of what we call private property. If it's not yours, keep your fingers off of it. And then, of course, I don't know what was going on in God's mind when he gave Moses the later commandments, the 9th and the 10th, but I'd like to think that maybe he came up with the 10th as a way to reinforce the 8th. The 10th commandment says, thou shalt not covet. And when you look around the world and observe people who do steal, you'll find that quite often coveting is behind it. They see that you've got something and they really want it, and it seems to them to be so much more difficult to earn it or to talk you into giving it to them, so why not just go take it? But the 10th commandment basically says, if you didn't get it.
I think did he include that in the list of what the cost was?
I'm hearing a voice. Okay. I don't know why, but I heard somebody asking a question. But anyway.
Oh, sorry about that. Go ahead and continue, Larry.
Okay. Anyway, the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet, is a reminder that there are things that are yours and there are things that are not yours, and that it's not a healthy thing for you to look upon the possessions of others and desire them in a way that might lead you to do so through the use of compulsion. Work for it or try to persuade somebody to share it with you or give it to you, but don't steal it, because that would violate the 8th commandment. So those two of the 10 commandments, I think, are a good starting point for noting that Christianity does not sanction theft, and it does not imply anywhere, certainly not in the words of Jesus, that theft is okay if the government does it. But what about Jesus' own words? I want to cite several passages from Scripture where Jesus is actually talking about things that are in some way related to economics or economic systems. My favorite passage regarding redistribution of wealth is from Luke 12. It's Luke 12:13 through 15, where a man approaches Jesus and says to him, Master, speak to my brother that he divideth the inheritance with me. Speak to my brother that he divideth the inheritance with me. In other words, this man is saying to Jesus, I don't think I got a fair shake, or I like more than what I got, and the other guy got more than me, my brother. So you've got some power and influence. Can you get some of that and get it my way? It's a kind of redistribution request. And, if Jesus had replied in any way like, well, hey, I'll look into it. Oh, yeah, we got to make sure it's equal. Okay, I'll check in with the politicians. Maybe they can get some of it for you. Then I would say, hey, maybe socialists have a case here. But Jesus said nothing of the sort. In fact, he immediately rebuked the man for his envy. He didn't sanction in any way the man's request that he get more of the inheritance. Instead, Jesus went right to the core of the matter and said, man, who made me a judge or divider over you? Think of that. Who made me? I mean, this is the Son of God, and he's saying to this man who's asked him to redistribute the wealth, he said, who made me a judge or divider over you? And then he goes on to say, take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's wealth does not consist in the material possessions that he has. I think those of us who believe in liberty and free markets or capitalism will ultimately know that we've won the day that our leaders in Washington, whether they be Nancy Pelosi, Donald Trump, whoever they may be, when they have a revelation and tell the country on television, hey, we've been redistributing wealth hand over fist, buying votes with it, promising people this, and hoping they'll vote for us in the process so we can accumulate power and money here in Washington. But now we've decided that we're not the appropriate judges and dividers over you, so we're going to stop doing that. I'm not holding my breath for that day, but that's the kind of day I'm hoping for someday. So that would suggest that Jesus wasn't quick to want to redistribute wealth or call upon political authorities to do it on someone's behalf. Then you have the story that Jesus told of the Good Samaritan. I remember this coming up in a discussion on a television show in the Bahamas a few years ago. There were two men on either side of me on a stage, and they were the interviewers. I was the guy in the middle. And they were both of a socialist perspective. And one of them said to me, Mr. Reed, you are a capitalist. You made it plain you believe in capitalism. And I said, yes. And he said, but you're a Christian. And then he just paused as if, how could you be both? And I said, why do you think that one is incompatible with the other? And his response was, well, what about the Good Samaritan story? Doesn't that teach us that we should help other people, that we should that we need government programs to redistribute wealth and take care of the needy? And I had to remind him of that story, which involves a man on the road. I'm not sure where he was headed, but in any event, he came upon a man who was in dire need. He'd apparently been robbed and beaten to within an inch of his life, and the man needs help. And what does the Samaritan say to him? Does he say, oh, well, there must be a government program for you, or hey, call your social worker, or hey, when I get to the next stop, I'll make sure I get word somehow to the emperor so he can take care of you, or we'll find some government program for you. No, the Samaritan pitched in and helped the man of his own free will and with his own personal resources. That's why we call him the Good Samaritan. If that man had done any of those other things, or any ancient counterpart to those things, if he had just blown the man off and said it's government's responsibility in some way, we would not know him today, 2,000 years later, as the Good Samaritan. We'd probably call him the good-for-nothing Samaritan. And yet, so many people think, oh, one guy helping another, that's somehow a case for government. But you've got more people helping other people under capitalism than you ever have under socialism, and that's in part because there's more stuff to help them with under capitalism than you have under socialism. Then you have, from Jesus himself, the parable of the talents. As Jesus tells a story, there's a man who is leaving his estate for a period of time, and he wants to make sure a portion of his wealth is well cared for. He gets 3 of his servants, and by the way, he distributes some of his wealth to each of the 3, and the distribution is initially not equal. He gives the first servant a certain amount, and he gives the second one more, and the third one even more. I don't recall that the scripture actually lays out how much, but anyway, it was 3 different amounts three different people. And the man says to them, when I'm back, then you report to me and tell me what's happened to what I've entrusted you with. And then Jesus goes on and tells the story of the man's return. And he calls the three men to him and says, okay, what would you do with what I left with you? And the first man says, well, you'll be happy to know that I have exactly what you gave me. I buried it in the backyard and I took care of it and it's perfectly safe. And in the story, Jesus rebukes that man. What? Basically saying, you didn't do anything with it? And then he goes to the next man. He says, what'd you do with what I entrusted you? And this man says, oh, you'll be happy with me. I invested it, and I've got, I don't know, 2 or 3 times what you trusted me with. And he's praised. And then the third guy says, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, oh, those first 2 guys are pikers. I've got to return 10 times what you gave me. Well, if Jesus were a socialist and he were assessing this situation, he'd probably say to the first man, oh, good for you. You showed no greed. You're a good guy. We'll give you more. You need it anyway, since you didn't even earn anything for yourself off what I entrusted you with. But instead, Jesus praises the third man because that guy knows how to create wealth. And in the story, he takes from the first man what he has and says, I'm going to give it to the third guy because he's the guy who knows how to magnify wealth. I can't imagine a socialist coming to those conclusions or to those actions. They don't sound socialistic at all. Jesus is in effect praising the man who knows how to create more wealth. Then you have the parable of the workers in the vineyard. This is an interesting story. This is where a man who owns apparently substantial properties invested in grapes, vineyards, and he apparently is eager to bring in the harvest while it's fresh. He hires some workers early in the morning one day and agrees to pay them a certain wage. They agree in return. And then partway through the day, the man realizes that he's got to hire more workers if every grape is to be brought in. So he hires more workers around noontime, and he offers to pay them the same as what he offered the workers for a full day who started early in the morning. And then late in the day, maybe with an hour or so to go before dark, he hires his last batch of workers, and even they are promised the same wage as the guys who started the day early in the morning. Later, the workers gather, and of course, the first guys are complaining to the boss. They're saying, wait a minute, this is not fair. We worked for you all day long, and the guys who come in at noontime or worked only the last hour, they get the same wage. That's not fair. And of course, a socialist would say, oh, you're absolutely right. We're going to have to do a little redistributing here to be fair. But Jesus has the man responding this way. He says, it's my money. Didn't you agree to the wage I offered? And then he says, go away from me. I gave you what I promised. You gave me your end of the deal. End of story. Well, that to me seems like not a tale for socialist redistribution, but rather a pretty strong endorsement of things like the right of contract, voluntary contract, of private property, and perhaps even supply and demand. My guess is that late in the day, the owner of the vineyard realized he had to pay a premium in order to get people to come out at the end of the day and work for an hour before dark. So that's not the sound of a socialist speaking. It's the sound of somebody who seems to be a lot more sympathetic to private property, contract, and supply and demand. Then, of course, you have Romans 13, where, I might be off on that particular chapter. In any event, the passage I'm thinking of is when Jesus says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God that which is God's. It's in response to a group of Pharisees who were always trying to challenge Jesus, try to nail him in a moment of defiance against the state so they could report him and have him arrested. They have a coin and they say, okay, what about taxes? What about this coin? Something to that effect. And Jesus replies, well, if it's Caesar's, give it to Caesar. And some people take that line to mean, Jesus is sanctioning the use of government taxation, and perhaps even for any amount the government might claim and for any purpose it might claim it for. I think that's quite a leap. I think this is a very clever response on the part of Jesus, in which he really leaves to each individual the question of what is the proper role of government. That's a matter for another day, another debate. Jesus is simply saying, well, if it is Caesar's, then give it to him. But maybe it isn't Caesar's. That's something you have to decide. That's what I read between the lines anyway. It certainly isn't some kind of blanket endorsement for anything that Caesar claims is his, or no matter how he tries to get it or what he does with it once he takes it. I mean, that would be quite a leap to assume any of those other things. There's another line in the New Testament where Jesus makes the point that it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter heaven. And that's often taken as a sign, see, he doesn't like rich people. So therefore he must be sympathetic to schemes that would redistribute, that would punish wealth, that would hold back these greedy people who want to accumulate more wealth. That's not the way I see it, because it would be so totally counter to everything else I know of Jesus and the rest of the New Testament. I think this is a call, as Jesus often issued, to character. It's a call to prioritize. It's a call to get your priorities in order. It's a recognition that things like great wealth, and there are a lot of such things, are temptations. Jesus is saying, and this is supported throughout the New Testament, that great wealth brings with it not some stamp of guilt, but rather great temptation. And all you have to do today is just look at Hollywood, and you see how, or the world of athletics. There are a lot of people in those fields where wealth sometimes comes quickly and in great quantity who can't handle it. And it ruins them. They allow their wealth to ruin them. But there are lots of others for whom these things happen, for whom great wealth comes their way because of their talent, their investments, or any number of other things, and they handle it fine. And they're great philanthropists, and many of them are good Christians. They don't allow the wealth to corrupt them. That's what Jesus was warning against here. And all you have to do is to just watch people with great wealth that comes their way suddenly. And you'll find that, yeah, it's tough to maintain character. A lot of people don't, and they can't handle it. But that's no reason to not go out and earn it in the first place. It's just, if you do, make sure you don't lose your priorities. Don't stop thinking that you need God, I think is what Jesus would also say. Some people who look upon that phrase as some kind of endorsement of socialism are also quick to point out the occasion when Jesus drove the money changers from the temple. And they say, see, money changers, those are capitalists, people making money. And what did he do? He drove them out of the temple. So therefore, he must have been socialistic, or at least anti-wealth, anti-capitalist in some way. But please note where it was that Jesus was driving these money changers from. He was not driving them, and never drove a money changer, whether that is simply a merchant or somebody who's charging for something he's not authorized to. In any event, he never drove one from a marketplace, never drove a money changer from a bank. He was driving them from the temple, which I think he would be quick to say is God's house. And for the same reason, if you showed up at a funeral with a kazoo and started playing Happy Days Are Here Again, somebody's going to ask you to go someplace else. This is not the time, not the place to be playing Happy Days Are Here Again with a kazoo. And that's what Jesus was doing. He was saying this is not a proper activity for this time and place. Some scholars go further and point out that there's some evidence to believe that some of those people were defrauding some of the people who wanted to gain entrance to the temple. Maybe so. In any event, there may be more than that one good reason to drive them from the temple. Finally, if you look around the world and ask yourself which kind of system, socialism in one variety or another, or capitalism of one shade or another, which tends to actually solve more problems, which tends to do a better job at feeding people, clothing them, housing them, raising their standard of living, defeating diseases, and improving the lifespans and what have you. It's not the socialist countries of the world. And this isn't something that we can just kind of assume any longer. There are indexes that are compiled. Two in particular that are especially good: the Index of Economic Freedom that comes out every year from the Heritage Foundation and I think the Wall Street Journal. Then there's one from the Fraser Institute in Vancouver, Canada, called the Economic Freedom of the World Index. They attempt to measure the degree of economic freedom or capitalism, things like private property, private ownership, free markets, price systems, and so forth, incentive, entrepreneurship, versus central planning and heavy government involvement in the economy. And then they look at their degree of prosperity as well. And it's like night and day. The freest countries in the world are invariably the ones that do the best job at feeding, clothing, and housing people at higher levels than the socialized countries. The socialized ones at the far end of the scale, the worst, of course, are North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, the ones that for decades have said, we're for the people, we're the ones interested in helping the poor and so forth. Well, in the end, they just don't do that. They concentrate power in the hands of politicians who take care of themselves and jail dissidents and otherwise make sure their country stays way behind the economic productivity of more capitalist countries. So if you look at that and then say, well, didn't Jesus want people to live better? He didn't want them to die early and of miserable deaths and short lives. No. So why would he ever endorse a system that produces poverty on such a grand scale as socialism does? You also look around the world and ask yourself this question: where does the bulk of foreign aid go? I have a lot of problems with foreign aid. Maybe you do too. But it's noteworthy that it's almost entirely in one direction. You don't have socialist countries bailing out capitalist ones. Cuba is, sometimes they'll do a little bit of this just to score political points, but the vast bulk of foreign aid is going from capitalist countries who are far better at producing wealth in the first place to socialist countries to bail them out of their problems that their own system created. Well, so my bottom line conclusion is that I can find no passage in the New Testament that suggests Jesus was in any way sympathetic to socialists. Oh, by the way, there is one last one I forgot to mention. I should do this and then quickly open it to questions. There are people who say, well, what about the early Christians in the book of Acts who apparently sold their possessions and shared them communally? They kind of practice a sort of socialism. Doesn't that endorse socialism, at least some variety of it? Well, it's true that there were some early Christians who did that, and there are a lot of reasons for that. One, in those days, they probably didn't expect once they hit the road to proselytize that they'd ever get back. And so if they didn't expect to have anything to come back to, why not get rid of it now? That may have been a motivation. I don't know. But there's no commandment given anywhere then or in the subsequent books of the New Testament that suggests that this was anything other than descriptive. It was not prescriptive. The Apostle Paul never said to the audiences of Christians that he spoke to or non-Christians that, hey, you all need to divide up your wealth equally, sell everything you've got and so forth. He never commanded that. Jesus never did. 99% of all Christians who have ever lived since have not done that. It was a small group of early Christians who did it and may have been motivated by the unique characteristics of their day. My guess is a big factor in their thinking was, hey, we're a brand new faith. We run up against the opposition of the Roman authorities right from the get-go, the skepticism of the Jewish hierarchy. We can't have anybody say to us, you got a rich man in your midst, so maybe you guys are all in this just for the money. There have been a lot of reasons unique to their moment that led to their making that decision. But the bottom line is there's nothing that says in the New Testament that's the way all Christians for all time everywhere should behave economically. Divide everything up and not try to accumulate more than anybody else. That's not supported anywhere in the New Testament. So with that, I'm happy to go to the question period and John or Michael, you
Yep,
want to?
I will. I'm just going to stay as a disembodied voice,
Okay.
if that's okay. We do have a few questions coming in, and a quick reminder to everybody. Go ahead and type your questions into the chat. If you would prefer to ask that question privately, you can send a private message to me and let us know where you're asking your question from. This is an international call today, and I'd love to highlight the area where you're at. As questions are coming in, Mr. Reed, could you talk a little bit more about, or maybe just redress how I think my generation and the generation that follows me are really thinking that the only way to do good, the only way to care for people is through socialism. Could you explain a little bit more about how is voluntary action actually a preferred mechanism for caring for those in need?
Sure. Good question. The notion expressed in that sentiment, Michael, is that the politicians, once they get to office, they have then magically the compassion to care for others. And the rest of us who sent those politicians there just don't have the same compassion. There's something in the marble dust in Washington that makes you more interested in helping people when you get there than the people who sent you there in the first place. I've never bought that, and I think that's kind of ridiculous. Government doesn't have anything to give anybody except what it first takes from somebody. And usually they keep a pretty hefty portion as a bureaucratic brokerage fee to get the job done. And ultimately, government redistribution, more often than not, doesn't get the job done and creates more problems along the way. That's why I support private charity and think that any free and compassionate society would engage in it because for self-interest, because we all want a society where people are treated fairly and do well and can be customers of things we produce. But there's nothing that says if you get elected, you suddenly are more compassionate. Private charitable activities tend to hold the receivers of a charity accountable. They take into account the whole person more often than not. Whereas government, it doesn't say, hey, why are you poor? It just says, oh, you're poor, here's a check. And it may, in the process, reinforce some bad behaviors that led to the poverty in the first place. Whereas, Salvation Army, Red Cross, and they usually say, we're not going to make this a permanent thing, and we do expect something from you. And if bad behavior is part of the reason why you're poor, we really expect you to fix that. In other words, charitable activities are more accountable and therefore more effective in actually solving a problem. Politicians throw money around and say that they're more compassionate, but more often than not, they're cynically buying your vote by getting you or others dependent upon them and taking from others as part of the process. So every person has to ask the question, do you want a society where people do the right thing, such as help others, because they want to or because they have to? Which is more effective? Which ultimately is the way to get the job done and keep us free at the same time?
Absolutely. Thank you for answering that. So the first question we received, actually someone emailed me before the meeting even started, and it's a little left of today's content, not politically, just kind of left field.
Most people are. Well, left what I just said.
And so the question is, do you think businesses should submit, quote unquote, safe workplace plans to state governments in order to reopen the public?
That's a COVID-19 specific question. I guess I haven't thought specifically about the implications of what's implied in the question, but I would more. I think my gut feeling is to trust to the decisions of private individuals and their choices to act or interact. And if a business doesn't indicate somehow to the public that they are a safe place to do business, I don't think they're going to get the patronage. I think it's in their self-interest to indicate that they are. If you go the route of asking the government to somehow require that every business certify it, on the one hand, you might think, oh, that's an instant and effective answer. But you know what's going to happen if you go that route? It will get bogged down in endless red tape and visits by the bureaucrats and the safety police, and indiscriminate application or discriminatory application of the law, and maybe a few bribes along the way. Well, before COVID-19, we trusted pretty much to businesses to tell us and for us to make the judgment whether or not they're safe to do business with, and we did all right. And I don't see why we should depart from that.
Absolutely. Here's a question that's a little closer to our topic for the day. It's pointed, and so a good challenge from here in Kansas. Is there not a place where the disciples are instructed to get rid of all their earthly possessions?
Something close to that, yes, because that's Jesus's requirement, or something very close to that. I don't recall what exceptions you may have allowed. You know, even in Acts, those early Christians who are reported to have shared things equally, they are reported in the same chapter to be continuing to meet, in many cases, in their own homes. Well, how do you have your own home if you've been required to sell everything? But keep in mind, Jesus was beginning a new faith in a dangerous time, dangerous place. He wanted only the very best people he could find, beyond reproach, as far as possible. And he couldn't afford to have any of them tarnish the faith by being vulnerable to the charge that, you're all in it just for the money or whatever. So you have to look at what Jesus may describe for 12 particular people and recognize that that's not the same as prescribing for the next 50 generations of people all over the planet. I mean, Jesus had special reasons for wanting those who were to be his closest associates to be in a certain position. And he never thereafter said to anybody else, hey, or any other audience, everybody sell everything, give everything away. He praised through his parables those who are entrepreneurial in nature, who create wealth and solve problems accordingly while maintaining their faith and confidence in God. So even if you have some socialist sounding case regarding the 12 apostles, that's at best descriptive of those 12, not prescriptive of the next 2,000 years of people.
All right. Our next question comes from a friend in Indonesia. South Korea, this is going back to COVID. South Korea is using citizens' location data to restrain the spread of the virus. How do you think Jesus would see this issue?
Oh my gosh, that's that's a big one. Jesus, of course, did not specifically address state surveillance, so I'd have to try to put words in his mouth here. My guess is that I think he was an opponent of concentrated earthly power because he understood how power is corrupting. So my guess is he'd be very wary of the concentration of power so great that it involves a handful of political elites keeping an eye on the movements of millions of other people. I think he'd be the first to agree with Lord Acton that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I'm not aware of any passage in which he advocates that the answer to a problem is the vast growth in the police powers of the state. So I think he'd have some real problems with that.
Okay, and a question from here in Kansas again. I love this person. They always write a paragraph, so I have to find the question in this. In Jesus feeding the multitudes, this person encountered that particular point in the story as an argument for Jesus being a socialist. Have you ever encountered that? And if so, what have you countered with? And this person specifically mentions John 6, verse 26 as an option for that. And how did the socialist individual or person advocating for socialism respond to your counter?
Yeah, I have run across that. I've had people say, "Oh, what about the loaves and the fishes?" And he fed so many people, and doesn't that mean he's a socialist? Well, socialists don't do a very good job at feeding people to begin with. That's a real problem in socialist places like Venezuela, where people are leaving by the millions because they're not being fed and they can't find food. Um, uh, yeah, and under capitalism, capitalists are feeding people all the time. I mean, farmers are in the agriculture business not because they like you, they don't even know you, but they're producing stuff because there's something in it for them. It's capitalism and the profit motive and the price system that drives their activities to feed people they don't even know. I mean, Chick-fil-A feeds more people every day than Jesus fed at on the occasion of the loaves and the fishes. And by the way, if he were a socialist, he could have said when he was about to feed those 5,000, he could have said to his disciples, "Hey, I think there's a wealthy town nearby. Why don't you get your weapons and go over and take what those wealthy people have and bring it back here so we can feed these people?" No, he didn't do that. He used his own power to create new wealth, and that's what he gave out. He didn't steal from others and give it to the 5,000. He created it himself. That's an essentially capitalist activity.
Wow. I love that he used what he had to create value for others.
Yeah.
As a free market nerd, speaks to my heart.
He could have taken it. Yeah, he could. I mean, he had the power. He could have just snapped his fingers, and a lot of wealthy people would have had less, and he could have given that to them. But no, he created it anew, which is what a capitalist entrepreneur does every day.
We have really two observations. One person shared, didn't the Pilgrims and the Plymouth Accord show us that socialist systems didn't work? If I'm assuming you're familiar with that, maybe you could kind of explain that story for people who might not be with
Yes,
William
I've written
Bradford
about
in that situation.
Yes, I've written about this most recently in last November around Thanksgiving time. You can find that at fee.org, or you can go to my website too, lawrencewreed.com, and you just scroll through the blog, you'll back to November, and you'll find that piece about the Pilgrims. It's a famous story involving Governor Bradford and the settlement of Plymouth by the early Pilgrims in 1620. The first arrangement, which they were bound to by agreement with the sponsors back in Britain, was that they would grow what they could, put it in a common storehouse, and then distribute it equally to everybody. The idea was, well, that way we'll make sure everybody has something. But Governor Bradford, in his diary, records the results of this experiment, which lasted a couple of years. He said that a lot of slackers, I'm paraphrasing, but a lot of people who didn't have the same incentive as others, they stopped showing up early in the fields. After all, why should I work as hard as the next guy or harder than the next guy if I get at the end of the day, if I get just as much? So people just didn't work as hard, and those who did work hard kind of resented the fact that they got no more than those who sat on their fannies. And as a result, this socialistic arrangement led to the near starvation of the Plymouth colony. And then Governor Bradford says, we ended it. We just unilaterally, I had to end it. And he said, instead, he just told everybody, here, we're going to give you a piece of property here. It's yours. You grow on it what you want to grow, sell it for what you can get for it. And the proceeds are yours. And, in no time at all with that private property approach, people worked harder, planted more, took care of the harvest because they had a direct incentive in caring for it, and they prospered. The Pilgrims' experience is a devastating assault on socialism and a fantastic endorsement of private property and free markets.
Absolutely. This is another statement, and I'll ask you to just kind of respond to it. There's not really a question here for you, but a quote from here in Kansas. I think socialism or big government robs us of our ability to act charitably. And then, sorry, somebody typed in the chat and I lost the question. After Hurricane Katrina, I was preparing to donate to the Red Cross. Then Congress sent several $100 million to New Orleans, with the promise of billions more to follow. So I thought, what's the point of my $25 to the Red Cross?
Yeah, it's amazing to me that with the government claiming that it's, its duty to do so many things for us. It's still amazing to me that so many people give anyway to private charitable activities. But I have often come across people who think that way. I found myself sometimes thinking, gee, why should I give to the Art Institute? They're getting government money. They don't need mine. It's interesting, too, to note that socialists don't really behave personally with their own wealth the way they want you to behave at the point of a gun. There's nothing that says a socialist can't today write out a personal check to the government, to the Department of Health and Human Services, or whatever department they want. But they don't do that either. If a socialist wins the lottery, he never donates it to the government. And yet they're quick to want to donate your money and to force you to donate it, whether you want to or not. So they're duplicitous in so many ways. They don't give to the government, as a rule, a nickel more than they're required to at the point of a gun. And yet they claim to have a monopoly on things like compassion and helping people.
Well, thank you, everybody, for your questions. At this point, we're at the top of the hour. Mr. Reed, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to pass back to John Todd to see us out.
Thank you.
Larry, thanks a million for being with us today. Again, we can buy your book. Tell us how we can get to the link we need to buy your book.
Yes, it's called Was Jesus a Socialist? Same as the title of this lecture. It's available on Amazon or barnesandnoble.com, maybe other booksellers too, I don't know yet, but those two for sure. Just type in my name, that should bring it up, or Was Jesus a Socialist, and my name, you'll find it very quickly. And it's available for pre-order now for about $15, and it'll be shipped in about a month from now.
On behalf of Wichita Pachyderm Club, Americans for Prosperity, we want to thank everyone for joining us today.